Okay, let's begin by discussing what is probably the most beneficial information that I can give you at this point, and that is a quick overview of how the modern pistol works, what its individual parts are, and how those parts serve the overall function. Let me begin by pointing out that handguns in this most common form that we're going to talk about, they come in all shapes and sizes and colors, but their functions and their functionality are all almost exactly the same. Here's the function of a modern pistol in layman's terms. 90% of modern pistols will function this way. You push the stick with the bullets in it inside the handle so that the round end of the bullets face forward, and you push the stick into the handle until it clicks into place. And then you hang onto the handle tightly while resting your finger up above the trigger area. You never put your finger inside that trigger area until you're ready to fire. And then you pull back on the top half of the handgun, which is spring-loaded. You pull it all the way back until it stops, and then you let it go. If there's any safeties on that particular weapon, which there probably won't be, you click them off so that you can see a red dot. And from there, all you've got to do is pull the trigger, and if it goes bang, then you did it correctly. However, here's why a layman's understanding of a handgun is not good enough. So in order to develop true confidence and really true ability with your handgun, a simple layman's understanding of how they work is not enough. You've got to know a little bit more about these things than that. And I promise you, no matter how foreign guns seem to you right now, soon they won't be. Soon you'll have a very natural understanding of how these guns work and why they work the way they do. And therefore, you'll be on your track to actually developing real confidence with your gun. Why is confidence so important? Because safety is born in confidence. Unless you're confident with your weapon, you're never going to be effective with that weapon, but even in a more basic sense, you'll never be safe with that weapon. Now again, no matter how new to this subject you are, I promise you, you will get there. My desire for you is that once you leave this program, once you leave all discs of this program and you've put into practice the advice that you're going to get throughout it, my desire for you is that you'll always be the most educated in any group that you're in terms of handguns. You can be that person. Because guns mechanically are very, very simple contraptions. They're not complicated. You need to separate all the masculinity and all the emotion from what a weapon is. Because there's nobody on this planet who's born with an intuitive understanding of how weapons work. Everybody who's confident with them and good with them has learned that. And chances are they've learned it in a far more roundabout way than what you're about to experience. So moving forward in this program, I mentioned in the introduction that there are going to be times where you might feel a little bit uncertain about what I'm teaching, in the sense of, do I really need to know this stuff? Pat's getting pretty detailed here, he's spending a lot of time here, he's being a little repetitive there. Do I need to know this stuff? And that's when I'm just asking you to dip into that well of patience and have some trust in me. I've taught a lot of beginners this stuff, and I know when you need to be repetitive, and I know when you need to have the technical understanding, and then there are going to be times where I know that you don't need that technical understanding, and I'll tell you that. So be sure to have faith and patience as we move forward in this program. And this chapter could be a good example of when you're going to need that faith and patience, because now we're going to move beyond layman's terms and we're going to move into the technically accurate description of the way a modern pistol works. That said, here goes. Now this is going to sound a little overwhelming, but this is the technical description of 80% of the handguns that are currently on the market. They are a box magazine fed, polymer framed, short recoil operated, locked breech, semi-automatic pistol. That is the technical description. And that's also a description that very few people who even call themselves experts will ever understand. And so let's talk about what each of these phrases are saying. box magazine fed. This is simply saying that this handgun's ammunition is stored ready for use in a spring-loaded plastic or metal container called a magazine. Now we'll talk about why it's called a magazine and not a clip or anything else later on. But all you need to know for now is that the ammunition for 80% of the handguns that people use out there is stored in a spring-loaded box that slides into the handle, just like this one, called a magazine. Polymer frame. Well, we're going to get into the names of each of the components of a handgun in more detail later on. All you need to know for now is that the frame of a handgun is this part. It's the base of the handgun, if you will. It's the part that you hang on to, but it also includes the lower half of that handgun. Really, it's the foundation of the handgun. And so then why do we say polymer framed? What does that mean? Well, polymer is a construction material, just like metal or wood. But polymer is a plastic substance, and it's become the most popular and common material used in handgun frames today because it's extremely strong and it's lightweight. And that's why well over 80% of the handguns that you'll find will have polymer frames. So that covers box magazine fed and it covers polymer framed. So then what about short recoil operated? What does that mean? Well, this is referring to the way that ammunition is ejected from the gun's firing chamber after the bullet is fired, and the way that the next round of ammunition is loaded into the firing chamber. Now, hang on, I know that I just dropped a few more gun terms on you. We mentioned ammunition, ejected, bullet, round, firing chamber. Don't worry, we're going to cover all those parts and the different terminology out there shortly. For now, just know that 80% of all handguns that you're going to encounter are in this category of being recoil operated, meaning that it's the action of the gun actually shooting a bullet that then automatically loads and readies the next cartridge for firing. Get it? It's an automatic process rather than a manual one. And we're going to talk about that later because there are guns out there that you have to manually manipulate between each and every shot, but not the modern handgun. The physical force of the gun firing pushes the top half of the handgun rearward against a spring, and the inner workings of the handgun are designed to take advantage of that motion and use it to eject away the spent cartridge and insert a fresh one from the top of the magazine. And so, it's as simple as that. That's what we mean when we say recoil operated. It's recoil operated instead of needing to be manually operated or manually cocked, for another gun term, between each and every shot. And so we've scratched a few things off that technical description. There's box magazine fed, polymer frame, short recoil operated. What's next? Locked breech. What does that mean, locked breech? Well, all it means is that when the handgun is ready to fire, the round of ammunition is completely loaded into the firing chamber where it will be when the ammunition detonates, thus sending the bullet down the barrel. Now, some guns, especially machine guns, don't actually insert the ammunition into the firing chamber until you press the trigger, but not a modern handgun. In a modern handgun, the cartridge is kept in the firing chamber, and that is all we mean when you hear the term locked breech. And last of all, the last part of that technical description is semi-automatic. I'm sure you've heard this term. Well, what does semi-automatic mean? Well, this is describing what sort of action must take place before a bullet is ready to fire. Okay? So on a pump action shotgun, for example, one of these, the forearm has to be pumped to cycle the shotgun's action mechanism. And when you manually pump that action mechanism, you eject the spent cartridge from the firing chamber and you load a fresh one from the magazine. And again, that's what you call a pump action shotgun. And you'll notice you have to exert a lot of force to make that happen. It's not automatic at all. Similar to that is what's known as a bolt action rifle. Perhaps you've heard that term. You have to manually operate the bolt to eject the spent casing where the bullet just shot out of, and you have to then push the bolt forward to peel a fresh cartridge off the top of the magazine and insert it into the firing chamber. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, we have fully automatic weapons. And this is not what a modern handgun is. A fully automatic weapon is one in which you simply press and hold the trigger down and bullets continue firing until either the magazine runs out of ammunition or you release your finger from the trigger. These are, again, fully automatic weapons. And so you see the two extremes on this spectrum of operation. Automatic at one end, completely manual at the other. In the middle of the spectrum, that's where we find semi-automatic weapons. And 80% of the handguns that you'll encounter as an armed citizen, and 80 to 90% of the rifles that you'll ever encounter as an armed citizen, will fit into this semi-automatic category. What that means is, when you press the trigger, only one bullet is fired. And in order to fire another bullet, you've got to release your finger from the trigger and then press it again. But what separates the semi-automatic action mechanism from the manual action mechanism is that you don't need to manually operate any sort of bolt or pump or slide to eject the spent casing and insert a new one. The simple act of firing the bullet performs all those functions. And so again, this is the semi-automatic action, and this defines 80% of the handguns that you'll encounter as an armed citizen. So perhaps you've heard of all these terms before, or maybe that was the first time you were ever exposed to them. Either way, that's great. What you've got now is a technical and scientific and chronological explanation of what happens when you manipulate the trigger of a handgun. That said, one of the best ways to learn this stuff is not only repetition, but just seeing it in action from the comfort of a video, such as this one. And so what I want to do now is just walk you through the process of readying a handgun for firing and then actually firing it. I'm going to demonstrate this in real life, and we're going to demonstrate this through computer animation. We're going to go very slow at first so you can watch it all happen, and then we're going to speed it up and show you a few more times. And this is going to be interesting. If you've never seen this before, especially. After this, we're going to get into what makes a handgun what it is, what all the various components of a handgun are, and most importantly, we're going to discuss how to select a handgun that is going to be perfect for you. First, a loaded magazine is inserted into the pistol's hollow handle, into what is known as the magazine well. Second, the top half of the pistol, which is known as the slide, is pulled all the way back against the spring which keeps it in place. The magazine, which is spring-loaded, pushes a cartridge up into the area of the handgun which is known as the action of the handgun. And third, the slide is released, and the heavy-duty spring causes the slide to spring forward and snap into the closed position. And while doing so, if we slow this down, you'll see that the cartridge that was at the top of the magazine is caught in the way of the slide and pushed forward out of the magazine, where the rounded nose of the bullet slides up what's known as the feeding ramp, and then the bullet goes directly into the rear end of the barrel, which is known as the firing chamber. Now, two important notes. You only have to quote-unquote charge the handgun or operate the slide to manually put a bullet in the firing chamber once per magazine. Since it's the detonation of that round of ammunition in the firing chamber that causes the slide to recoil back and eject the empty casing, thus loading a new one, then you only have to do it once per magazine. Now, if there's already a live cartridge in the firing chamber when you insert the magazine, then you don't have to cycle the slide at all. In other words, you don't have to charge the firearm because it's already charged. The other note is you don't want to just release the slide slowly with your hand. You want to let the firearm do its job and just release it and let the spring carry the slide forward and snap the action closed. You see, if you release it slowly, it's possible that the action won't close all the way. Now, that's fine. It's not going to hurt you at all. The problem is the gun simply won't fire. And so therefore, to eliminate problems, the best practice is, even though it seems like you're doing something that might be hard on the mechanism, I promise you're not, just pull that slide all the way back and then release it forward. Let its own spring carry it home and snap the action closed. Once that action's closed, now the gun is ready to fire. If the handgun has a manual safety or a safety catch, whether it's a button or a lever, that has to be disengaged before you're able to press the trigger to make the gun fire. Now I will say most handguns designed for self-defense do not have manual safeties, but we're going to discuss that later. If it does have a safety, then what that safety's job is to make sure that if you accidentally pull the trigger when you didn't mean to, the gun will not fire. But if you're ready to fire at this point, if it either does not have a safety, or if the safety has been disengaged by pushing a button or by clicking a lever so that usually red, a little red dot is exposed, which is the international sign for a disengaged safety, then in order to fire that gun, all you've got to do is press the trigger. Pressing the trigger releases an internal or external spring-loaded hammer or striker, which hits a firing pin, which then slams into the ignition source, which is stored at the rear of every single cartridge. That ignition source is called a primer, which detonates, causing a tiny little pop and a spark, which then ignites the propellant or the gunpowder inside the cartridge. And of course, as that burns, it creates a massive amount of pressure in the blink of an eye, and it causes the bullet to go zipping out of the barrel. And then, as we discussed a moment ago, the recoil of the force of the bullet, because remember, every action physically is followed by an equal and opposite reaction. And so the recoil force of the bullet zipping out of the barrel causes the top half of the handgun, which is spring-loaded, to fly rearward through its entire range of motion, just as if you were operating it with your hand, even though you don't have to. So the slide, just by the force of the bullet leaving the gun, flies rearward, hits the end of its range of motion, and then springs forward again, snapping closed. And as you now know, during that range of motion, two important things happen. First, as it springs backward from the force of the bullet, the spent piece of ammunition, which remains in the firing chamber after the bullet is fired away, which is called the casing, is pulled out by a little tiny hook or a clip that's called the extractor, and it's flicked away. And then as the slide reaches the end of its range of motion and begins snapping forward again from the force of its own spring, the next round of ammunition on top of the magazine is caught in the way of that slide, and it's pushed up the feeding ramp and into the firing chamber in the exact way that a bullet is loaded when you cycle the slide with your hand. It all happens automatically. And then you're ready to press the trigger again and again and again and again to continue firing bullets downrange. Now, when you fire the final cartridge that was in a magazine, one of two things can happen depending on the style or the engineering of that handgun. In most modern handguns, after you fire the last round of ammunition, the slide will remain locked in the rearward position. This is both to let the shooter know that they have fired their last round of ammunition and to make reloading easier and faster. However, in some semi-automatic pistols, the slide will not lock back after having fired the last cartridge. And in those, you won't know that your magazine is empty until you press the trigger one final time and only hear a click. So now that you have that understanding, you have that knowledge, you literally know how 80% of modern handguns out there function. That's wonderful. I mean, seriously, you know how all the handguns on this table work with the exception of this guy. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. But for now, I want to make sure that this lesson is driven home. So I want to show you this just a few more times. We're going to go faster, and you're going to see it from a few different angles with a few different firearms and both computer animation and live action. That's just going to take 5 minutes here, 5-6 minutes, and it's going to help ingrain this into your mind. You'll appreciate that later on. But before we do that, I want to take a small sidestep and explain how the magazine of the handgun fits into all this in just a little bit more detail. This will take 30 seconds. The only job of the magazine is to securely store a handgun's ammunition and keep it ready for firing, and to make loaded cartridges ready for the handgun's cyclical loading action between each and every shot. Does that make sense? So it performs this job simply by using a very strong spring, which it compresses between a base plate and what's known as the follower, as the ammunition is pushed upward and as the slide does its job, loaded into the gun. So that's it. Pretty simple. That's how a magazine functions. So that's it. You've seen it all in action now. Now, if it still doesn't make sense, if you couldn't re-explain this to somebody yet, don't worry about that. Nobody learns this stuff all at once. You're on your way to learning this stuff in the most efficient way that there's ever been to learn this stuff. So rest confident in that. And now let's take advantage of the wonderful concept for human education known as repetition, and let's watch some of these guns in action. Okay, so just to help you out with a little bit more interesting video here rather than all of our computer demonstrations, I want to show you what it looks like out here on the range to do this stuff. So just very simply and very succinctly, the function of a semi-automatic handgun is as follows. So you take your handgun and you have to verify that it's unloaded in order to load it. So we check the chamber. Yes, it is unloaded. Release. And I can either just leave it released, or if I want, I can lock the slide back. If you're not used to your handgun, the dexterity required to do that may not be something you're interested in doing. No problem, leave it forward. We know the gun is empty. And if you want at this point, you can conduct some dry fire practice. That's great too. Check your trigger press. Make sure everything's all kosher, make sure everything's all good there and you don't have any really terrible flinches. If you're ready to fire, take a loaded magazine, slide it into the handgun until you feel and hear the magazine seat and lock into place. There it is locked. If you want to test that, give it a tug. It doesn't come out. Very good. Now we cycle the action by rotating the slide all the way to the rear and then let go. That handgun is now ready to fire. If there's a safety, you would have to disengage it at this point in order to fire. If there's not a safety, at least if there's not a manual safety, which is the case with this Glock 17, then it is simply ready to fire. And at that point, you would don your grip, get in your shooting stance, take aim, fire your first round. When you're done firing, continue pointing at the target. Keep your finger along the frame of the handgun, not inside the trigger guard, and then come back down to ready. We're going to do a lot more demonstrations at the end of this part of the program, and especially at the end of the third part of the program. But in a nutshell, that shows you how these handguns work. To see it a little more quickly, I'm going to take the magazine out and I'm going to eject this live round so we can start from a state of having an empty handgun. This time I'm going to lock the slide back. I'm going to reinsert the magazine into the magazine well. You just simply push it in, and if it won't come out, then it's there. It's ready to go. If you didn't get it all the way, it might fall out when you tip it up, or at very least, you'd be able to pull it out. You can see the magazine being fed into the handgun from this angle. Once it's locked, you can either disengage the slide lock, which will send it forward, inserting around into the firing chamber, or you can just pull it all the way back to manually disengage the slide lock and let it go forward. You're ready to fire again. Last round fired, you can see the slide is locked to the rear. That's a feature on a combat grade handgun to let the shooter know his gun is empty. I can eject that magazine, take a new one, pop it in. Once again, slide is locked to the rear. Eject the magazine. If I wanted to continue shooting, I could at this point. Otherwise, I can lower my gun to low ready and step away from my target. There it is, hopefully with a little bit more interest or a little more visual stimulation than our animations, the very simple function of a semi-automatic handgun.